I called in the fire force, and I had to give an assessed map reference. It was Mike Boylace with Jerry Strong. They came in the K car, but they came higher than normal, so I could guide them in. I threw smoke once they saw us, and then they took heavy fire, and we had to help suppress it from our side. The fire force came in and had a very successful contact, 3 commando, and they literally neutralized the group, and we got 1 capture out of it, old Webster.
Okay, it's my great honor to have Robert Parker with us today. Robert was a policeman in the BSAP and spent time, obviously, with the support unit and with the police special investigations section, the SIS. We've had quite a few other BSAP guys, some of whom were also in the SIS. Rob, normally how we start these interviews is you tell us a little bit about your childhood. I know you were born in South Africa and went up to Rhodesia to visit your brother, and that's what inspired you to end up joining the BSAP in Rhodesia. But perhaps you could start off by just giving us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in the police and Morris Depot, etc.
Okay, I went to school at Maritzburg College, Peter Maritzburg in Natal. After my trip up to, it was 2 years later, we had an interview in Peter Maritzburg, and we were all flown up by Air Rhodesia to Salisbury. We went into Morris Depot. Rob Stewart was our squad instructor. He was the well-known Rhodesian rugby player. Yes, Depot was quite enjoyable. Most of the other guys there were adventurous types. Got up to all sorts of things. After passing out from Depot, I was sent down to Bulawayo to the driving school there, where we had to be trained into driving Land Rovers and motorcycles. And we were given a few duties there. One of them was the Australian or the Rhodesian Australian rugby match, which I had to attend, and I was detailed to that thing up in the stands. There was an incident there where someone threw a beer bottle and hit one of the guys, African guys selling snacks on the edge of the field, and I had to attend to that. Not very well, because the guy who threw the beer bottle got away with it scot-free. And then from there, I was sent up to Wankie district. I arrived at Wankie, and I was met by Chief Inspector Sandy Johnson, who was an Englishman, and he interviewed me, and he's more concerned whether I could speak Afrikaans or not, and because he was having problems at the number 2 colliery Railton Club, and he wanted me to go and listen out there and things. But anyway, I was sent up there for a licensed premises check on my first night shift duty. Which
is this about 1970, Rob?
This is 1969 still.
Okay.
Possibly latter half of 69.
All right.
And then had a disaster there where my vehicle nearly ran down the road without anyone in it. But the patrons of the club were unbelievably good and sorted it out and congratulated the guy who jumped in the vehicle and stopped it. And then I did patrols in Wankie, and from there I was transferred to Sivinkwazi, which is on the Zambezi to the east of Wankie. I had my member charge was Dave Lynn, super guy, and there did a lot of vehicle patrols and foot patrols from the where the Gwa River met back to Sivinkwazi and Sidindi Island area and that. And I really enjoyed that place. We did boat patrols up to Wankie Angling, east to Mulabezi, and it was a lovely post. I was then transferred from there by boat, funnily enough. They said it was the first boat transfer they'd ever done, to Binga, which was in the middle of Lake Kariba. My new boss there was Tim Potter. He was a wonderful boss. And his first words to me is, you go out and patrol and look for new things and explore. You'll come up with all sorts of things. And they were wise words, because it was so true. And then at Binga, the memories there were the vehicle patrols I did to Chiserera, the Boosie track, Lobengula's grave was in the area. There was lots of areas there. Chetty Island, the boat patrols were wonderful. We went as far as Bumi, and we used to go to Msuna quite often. We had 3 big boats there, the Fort Usher, Fort Charter, and the Admiral Tate. And they were potent boats. The Usher had 2 inboard, outboard Penta motors, and I think the others had BMW motors, but they were lovely boats.
Did you have any interesting challenges with wildlife? Because that's quite wild, that country.
It was wonderful, you know, in those boat patrols. I never forget seeing the elephant swimming out to the islands with their trunks being used as snorkels. We saw a lot of wildlife in that area, especially down south of Chiserera, along the Boosie track there. There were big herds of elephant down there as well. And then the Mulabisi, I remember Mike Johnson's Mulabisi, wonderful time spent there. And Angus van Jaarsveld's the rest camp pub at Binga itself. We had wonderful times at these places. There were different people, and it was a lovely, lovely life we had there. Near the end, late in 1970, my father got very ill and passed away in Natal, and I went home to attend the funeral there. My mother very kindly gave me the family car, which was a little Morris 1100, because she couldn't drive. And with that, I was given a pug dog, a puppy. And I came back to Rhodesia with that. And after a short time at Binga, I was then transferred to Victoria Falls. I remember arriving at Vic Falls early evening with my Batman in the car with me and my dog in the back seat with all my possessions, and driving down the road and seeing the flashing lights of the casino at the end of the road. Anyway, I took them all, found a bed in the mess and sorted my Batman out and all that. And I thought I'll go down to the casino because this was new to me, all the bush life of Binga. And I went in there, started on the one on bandits, made enough money to get into the gambling hall. And I think I made about $200, and it was more than my monthly salary. And the next day, I was walking around the Big Falls charge office, you know, just thinking of dollar signs and how I was going to make more. And I went back that evening and I lost $250, and that was the end of my gambling. A good lesson learned. We did quite a bit of stuff. I had an interesting walk down into the gorges where a fisherman came in and said that a fellow fisherman, he found a body in the gorge, a decomposed body, and he was sure to belong to a fellow fisherman who had drowned two months earlier. And I went down there with him, and unfortunately, we got there, the water had risen again, and the body was no longer there. So we got everyone to search down the edge of the river, and we eventually found a skull in a pool on the edge of the Zambezi, and got this thing out. And I noticed it had dental fillings, which made it very unlikely to be a local fisherman, and took it back to the police station in a plastic bag. And we later, I looked in the missing persons things there, and it was a year earlier, an SAP guy had, while swimming high up the river, had drowned. And we then had his dentist flown up from South Africa, who positively identified the skull, and his wife finally got his estate after that. It was my first job there. One day the Deputy Commissioner of Police arrived on a quick visit. He landed at the Binga airfield, and he arrived at the police station, and he told Tim Potter, who was our boss, that he wanted to wash up at our mess. And I had to take him across to the mess. And it was mid-morning, and the Batmen were busy cleaning up there. And I showed him the bathroom. And I was waiting to take him back to the police station when I heard shouts from in the passageway. And I went in there, and one of the guys had a barn owl that he'd rescued from that had fallen out of its nest. And he had it in a cardboard box above his cupboard. And to give it a snack, you put your arm out and it would fly to you, and it's quite well trained in that. Well, anyway, the Deputy Commissioner pointed towards it and shouted out, "What on earth is that?" And it flew at him. And then in the panic, had landed on the lounge chair there and defecated on the cushion. And he went into an absolute rant about it, about living with animals. We'd all turn into animals and all sorts of things like that. And then I took him back to the police station, but that wasn't the end of it. A week later, we got a communication from Police General Headquarters to the effect that Tim, while he was in the police, would never become a commissioned officer. And the deputy commissioner left a year later, but the police pretty held Tim to that. And a few years later, he resigned because they weren't going to promote him. And to me, it was a complete travesty. That's one side of the police I disliked. And fortunately, those type of officers were in the minority. And I kept very clear of them after that. No, on one boat patrol, it was right out in the middle of the lake. There was a puff adder all coiled up, just floating on the waves, on the water. And I cut the boat motors and we drifted up to this thing. And myself and the African constable were standing there, just observing this thing, and just suddenly, like a coiled spring, it just flew into the boat. The two of us nearly did rear somersaults to get away from it. But another amusing incident on the water. But I loved my time there. We were pretty much left to ourselves, and we just had to get on it, get on with the job. And I think we did things very responsibly. Sort of, there was no, we enjoyed ourselves, yes, but and then Kazungula was. There was an SAP company based in the area. We had a little boat there, at, the P1, and did patrols there. We also had a pot license there. We had 2 animals a month to supply meat to the staff on the post. And we had the fishing gear. We used to fish above Katambora Rapids. A wonderful life. And then we did patrolling down to Panamatenga. Once a week we had to do a vehicle patrol down there. The game there, I remember herds of sable antelope and eland, the biggest herds I've ever seen in all my travels. And occasionally we'd see gemsbok there, which you didn't get anywhere else in Rhodesia. And on the river we used to occasionally see sitatunga on the marshy islands upstream of the post.
So you later joined Patu. Was it you joined Patu shortly after that?
No, I was in Patu before that because we'd had to do training in the Wankie district training, and I was put into Patu, and then Johnny Johnson was our stick leader, and he was at Vic Falls, and a stick of us was sent to do a patrol between Sibankwazi and Malabezi and back again, funny enough. And it was quite an interesting patrol. I remember seeing a honey badger on the thing, a little rattle, and showed no fear, chased us into the bush as well. And then crossing the Gwai, they got an Air Force helicopter to take us across, and it arrived a little early. And we obviously didn't do a good enough job in clearing a landing area for it. And it, on landing, the rotor tips struck the surrounding branches and caused a huge thudding sound. But the pilot carried on and took us across. But on the other side, if I recollect, the tech did a temporary repair by putting duct tape on the rotor tips, and off they flew again. That was my first part of patrol, and quite an experience. And then back to Kazungula. Had a boat accident there. We received information that there were lights seen in the evenings going from the Zambian Kazungula post across to the ferry site in Botswana. And myself, 2 SAP guys, and Chris Clark, who was the PO stationed there with me, we went out on the boat up the river, and we either hit something or something went wrong with the boat, because suddenly the boat lurched and turned over in the middle of the river. And after it happened, I remember we were doing a sort of a body count, and one of the SAP guys was missing. And after much shouting, we heard gurgling calls in the distance. And fortunately, there was a life jacket on the boat. I put it on, and off I swam, hearing gurgling calls all along the way, while the other 2 floated down on the overturned boat down the river. And eventually, hippo grunts everywhere, and eventually found the guy when he got to the on the river's edge, and he was vomiting huge amounts of water and things. And then slowly the two of us walked down the river, and we met up with the other two guys in the front of the police post. And then reality set in. We'd lost two FN rifles, and there was going to be huge repercussions for that. Anyway, I got hold of my bosses, and the following morning I was told that a pro aircraft was arriving from police general headquarters, and they came out and checked the boat out, brought a new motor, which wasn't needed because there was no damage. Later in the day, Superintendent Taffy Pugh arrived in his green Land Rover. He was a border control officer, police border control officer, and he brought with him an electronic magnet on a long rope, which he had got from the Wankie coal mine, which they used for recovering equipment in the mine shafts that had fallen underwater. And I was told to take him out to the river to the spot where we had overturned the boat. Unfortunately, the day before, we'd had one or two beers before we left, and the Zambezi is a huge river. And no ways would I have been able to find the exact spot. But to act efficient, took him to the spot, and we spent about an hour dragging this magnet and found nothing. He left and then said to me I was to carry on using the magnet until I found these weapons. And I went out with Chris Clark a few times. I think he thought I was nuts, but we never found them. I eventually got a written warning for the loss of the weapons. But to this day, I don't know what caused that accident. It was strange, but either we hit a hippo or something. I don't know.
Yeah. You had quite a few interesting sightings of sable and eland, and gosh, it sounds like a really adventurous posting. Were you doing some hunting for the pot and probably some fishing as well? And
we even had a key to the border post, and we used to go to Chobe Safari Lodge for the occasional evening too, and came back. It was just it was a lovely life for a youngster. And I remember going down to Panamatenga, you see these little grass shelters there with a San guy with his wife and a few kids. And they were hunter-gatherers, used to cross the border backwards and forwards. And I found they were very, you couldn't communicate with them. They were very expressionless guys. A few were employed by Parks and Wildlife as trackers and that. But it was all new to me. It was wonderful to see this sort of thing.
I can remember going to Kazungula and crossed the border into Chobe. I think it must have been about 1971, 72. I had a little bolt action rifle with me, a 6.5 Bruno, and my dad was driving us in a little Renault R10. And every time we were driving on this dirt road, every time we came across a tree that had fallen across the road, I wasn't sure whether it was an elephant that had pushed the tree over or whether it was the terrorists who had laid an ambush for us, or But anyway,
but when was that? 1971, you said?
Yeah, I think 71, somewhere around there, 1970, 71, around about that time, actually.
Yeah, things are pretty calm then. But we were, we were definitely looking out. They had Optique a little earlier, which I wasn't involved in, but I was at Wankie when that happened. But it was very quiet then, and it was a wonderful period in my career because it wasn't really a war, but you really appreciated the patrols we were on and things like that. It was a very different period.
Yeah, there was a humorous incident involving a young woman named Teddy Bear.
Yes, I remember that. There was Teddy Bear and Tiger. They arrived at the falls, much to the joy of the SAP guys there. The first time I met Teddy Bear was at the police mess in Vic Falls. She was one of the other patrol officers there. The next time I met Teddy Bear, I was down on patrol at Panamatenga, and she was based up in a treehouse in their camp. And Tiger had gone back to a nursing job in Bulawayo at that stage. And then an all stations message came out from drug section in Bulawayo that they were looking for this short woman with a distinct hair color and a large chest. And there was no doubt it was Teddy Bear. And she'd now moved up to the Kazungula camp up there. And a young patrol officer was sent out from Vic Falls to arrest her, which he did. And it took him 2.5 hours to take her back to the falls, which is normally a half-hour journey. The night shift patrol officer in Vic Falls detained her through the register in the detain book, and mysteriously she escaped that night. It was a few days later, she was rearrested in Bulawayo by the drug section, and her full true statement was taken and sent to the, because it was so sensitive, it was sent to the OC province, and he had one look at this, and he endorsed the whole docket, the investigation diary, saying that this is the most ludicrous story he's ever read. It's impossible to be true. And one or two patrol officers at Vic Falls who breathed a sigh of relief after that, and the whole thing. And I think tactfully the OC threw it out just to stop a scandal developing, because it would have caused a huge thing if this had got out. But that was the story of her. I heard later she'd got quite a responsible job in South Africa and settled down quite well in the end, but it was an interesting time.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a tragic accident involving a Land Rover, which resulted in a fatality.
While I was at the SAP camp, a radio message came in saying that one of their resupply vehicles had overturned, and one of the guys had been killed. So I reacted to that, and while driving along the little river road in the game reserve, SAP crowd in a Thames 5-tonner overtook me, and I thought, yep, there's going to be another accident now. And we got there, and we found an overturned Land Rover, which it didn't have the hood had been removed and the windscreen had been removed, and two very shocked guys there, and they pointed to the deceased guy under the Land Rover. He was lying there with the passenger seat on his chest. We then manually lifted the Land Rover, and we got him out, and I had to take the body through to the mortuary. The following day, I had to attend the post-mortem, and the pathologist, there was no broken bone in the body, and a pathologist said he died of suffocation as a result of the pressure of the seat on his chest. And I often wondered, those guys, probably because of shock, if they'd only realized using their rifles or something and maybe leave the vehicle, they might have saved the poor guy. But it's just one of those investigations we had to do.
Yeah.
No. Kazungula, I went back to Vic Falls, and then they had the Pierce Commission. We had to travel around with a crowd of them all around the Wankie district. We all know what happened there. The chiefs and tribal guys were all very pro that agreement, but the politicians put a stop to it. And then in the falls, it was quite a busy period crime-wise. Did a lot of investigations, and we were quite successful in catching the bad guys. We did. I hated traffic policing. I remember the highway patrol used to come up there, and we used to have to go out with them. And they always fined our mates, with some petty fine, and it was not good for public relations at that stage. We used to do the driving tests in the village. Days of the miniskirt, a lot of young girls passed quite easily, but there was no bribery. I'll never forget, there was a young Portuguese guy who passed his test, and instead of just following the patrol officer into the station for the documentation to be done, he went to his boot and produced a six-pack, which he presented to Patrol Officer Duncan Mackay, who then took him into the office and detained the poor guy for bribery. And it was a bit tough on the guy, I thought, but just one thing I remember there. And then from Vic Falls, I was transferred to Sibankwazi as member in charge there. There we had wonderful times at patrolling, and I did quite a few foot patrols together with. We used to send a lone constable every day from where the Gwaya met the Zambezi back to Sibankwazi, and on a less regular basis from Sidindi Island eastwards. And I accompanied them on a few of those patrols. I always look back at it and think, thank goodness they never came across an armed group, because what could have one guy done if he'd walked into an armed group of insurgents? Those were interesting. We had boat patrols from Wankie Angling. We used to stay there in the evenings sometimes, and coming down the Decker Rapids, you had to get into the main rough water channel, and in the middle of the rapids, you had the Decker Rock, which stood up out there, and which with the spotlight, you had to look out for that rock and do an immediate turn before to get around it, because if you hit that, it'd be the end of the boat. But and also going down there, all the red crocodile eyes all over. But what a life! It was. I really enjoyed doing the times there. We also had another boat problem there. Old Rob Kemp went down to Msuna with an army engineer, and they had a few beers with old Les Stanford there. And then on the way back, he had a bit of a problem and radioed me. I had flu at the time, and he radioed me and said he had a problem with the boat. And then I said, well, what is the problem? He said, well, he's stuck on the Zambian bank halfway to Lusaka. And then I realized things were a little bit more serious than that. And I got hold of the army camp up the road. And the only guy available, it was an RAR company, but the only guy available was a young subaltern from South Africa who was up there in attachment. And he came down with a few of the RAR guys, and we went out there to the Zambian side, and we tried to get this boat back into the water, but we couldn't because all the reeds had come up behind it. And eventually at 10 o'clock the next morning, after ferrying a lot more troops across, we got the boat back into the water. And all the tourists were looking at this thinking we were up to something on the wrong side of the border. But thank God that never got out, and the Zambians never found out. My bosses didn't find out because I didn't have to explain anything on that. But I think Rob will always remember that. Okay, after I left Sonkwazi, I got hepatitis, and I landed up in hospital with a whole lot of army guys. And they said they thought that it was spread from the army camp, the water supply. And then when I recovered from that, I was sent out to Madlambudzi, which is north of Plumtree. And one day I went into Plumtree, for work reasons. And Tim Potter, who was again my member in charge, said to me that there was a dog that had been going around the Plumtree High School trying to bite pupils there. And it was last seen going towards the service station in Plumtree. And I was sent out with the duty patrol officer to, he was to shoot it with a greener shotgun. And anyway, the two of us were there, and the dog was walking around in a strange way, and it was coming towards us. And I was waiting for the shotgun to go off, but nothing happened. And the dog jumped up at me, and I lashed out with my arm to try and fend it off, and it bit my hand. And then I turned around, and the policeman with me had got onto a tractor to get away from it. So I took the shotgun from him, and we shot the dog. And went back to Mashonaland, and 2 days later I was told that the dog was rabid, and I had to come in to get to be treated. And thinking I'd have a few days off in Plumtree, I came in and met the lady missionary doctor who had the serum, and she injected. She gave me a shot around the navel. It was just subcutaneous under the skin, and I thought I'd be staying at for further treatment. She said no. And she gave me 4 or 5 ampoules and some disposable syringes, and said I must go back to Madlambudzi and get the guy stationed with me there to inject me. Anyway, I got there, and he couldn't do it, so I ended up injecting myself. But that was one thing, and I had full trust in it because my father was a doctor, and anything a doctor said, I believed in those days. Madlambudzi was a very busy post. We'd have 2 or 3 rapes and murders a month, and it was very busy. But you had no social life there. It was just it was a tribal area, and we were allowed 1.5 days time off in Plumtree a month, and as soon as you sat down in Plumtree for your first beer, you get a report there's been another incident at Madlambudzi, and you have to pack up and go back. And I'll be honest with you, the year I had there, I was completely bushed at the end of it. And the final nail there was when I was at the Plumtree show, and the officer commanding province was there, and there's a whole crowd of police guys, and we were talking, and 2 very attractive young girls walked past, and I made a very rude comment about how attractive they were, and they were the officer commanding province's daughters, and that was that. I had to put in an application for support unit, and I was out of there within 2 weeks, and that's how I got transferred to support unit. Two South African policemen arrived from South Africa in a Land Rover, and the one guy, in fact, was ex-BSAP, and he'd been at Madlambudzi before. And what was happening, there was a gang from Madlambudzi who were using a pickup and stealing stuff in Joburg, and then driving across national borders without going through customs and things. And they were stashing all their stuff at Madlambudzi. And I went around with these two policemen for about 3 days, and we collected literally a ton of electrical items, jewelry, clothing, and we arrested 2 guys who were involved in this lot, and they were sent down to South Africa for trial. Just quite an interesting thing, but a long way to take all your stolen items to hide, but it was quite an interesting thing that happened. I had one other incident there going up. We also had a pot license there, going up to point 222, which is the southwestern corner of Wankie Game Reserve. I was driving along the road when suddenly a guy came hell for leather down the road on his bicycle. And I stopped, and he just shouted at me. He's being chased by a lion. And off he went down the road behind me. And I didn't, I thought this was exaggeration. I drove up the road. And about a kilometer further on, a lion just came straight out at me. I was in the Land Rover. And it hit the front of the Land Rover with its paw, and it bent it was like a grill in front of the radiator. I reversed, and it followed us for about 50 meters. And ever since then, I've been wary about going in safari vehicles because of that. But there was a lot of hunting going on in Botswana, and the elephant were very skittish and aggressive in that area as well. And I think that's what possibly caused it. But Support Unit started off with me. I was arrived there, and I was attached to H Troop. Was Andy Gray. He was in charge of H Troop, and then there was Alistair Hull and Brian Pitt were the 2 other guys. But when I started off there, we very seldom worked together because we were all hived off to GC and SB guys working in the field. All we seemed to do at the time was go around to murders and landmine incidents and things like this. And most of the murders were of alleged informers, and very few of them were actually had any connection with us. There were dip attendants, tribal secretaries, and it was all Zandler's new thing of intimidating the people to get them on sides, and it's had quite an effect on me. I think a lot of the army guys in that didn't see that side of the war. There were some horrible atrocities where people were put in huts and burnt alive, and that had quite an effect on my attitude about the opposition in the war when I saw all that. That's how I started off.
GC and SB stands for Ground Coverage and Special Branch, eh?
That's quite correct, yeah.
Ground coverage being sort of intelligence gathering.
Ground coverage was the duty branch intelligence gathering side of things, and SB were internal security, separate departments. Andy Gray, Brian Pitt, and Alistair Hull all got commendations for a meeting they had with Herbert Shungu, where they had to disarm themselves and sort things out with him. It was a very hairy sort of thing, and it was only a few days later that the same thing happened, and four SAP constables were murdered, and a Constable Mandaza, who I operated with before, he was with them, and he jumped off the Mazoe Bridge into the river to try and escape, and it was presumed that he drowned, but not a nice period. Thank goodness I was on leave over that period. One incident there was a guy, Vu, a well-known terrorist called Vu, and they put up posters all over the place for wanted dead or alive with a picture of old Vu's face on it. It was in the early stage of the war, and I was told later that they actually put the wrong picture up of this guy, and it was a period after this, John Goodchild, a support unit guy, observed Vu's group south of the Mazoe high-level bridge. And he said that the group was going in the eastward direction down the edge of the river. I was picked up at Nyamasoto and by chopper and taken there with my stick. And we were dropped further down the river. And as the chopper dropped us and was taking off, there was a burst of fire, and the pilot was hit in the hand. And I believe the tech did a very good job in helping him get out of the area. It was a few minutes later, I saw some guys walking towards us. It was my first proper contact, and I was probably shaking like a fly, and we opened fire and we missed. I don't know how, it was another lemon. And I met the pilot a while later, and he was not at all happy with my performance that day, but it was my first proper contact. And there, we were sent to Oscar base, they called it, and I used to have a lot of admin to do and sit reps to do and all this sort of thing, and I couldn't get out and patrol. And my brother took over the base, and I remember him saying, I complained to him, I can't patrol because of all this, and he just laughed at me and said, "You've got to learn to delegate." And at the time, it was unheard of, and he told me to get my sergeant major to do it all, which I did, and from then on, I was out permanently. And then went to Kotwa, and I went with Les Lloyd to Changara in Mozambique. We liaised with the Portuguese army guys there. Now, the coup had taken place, the coronation coup, and they were very nice guys, but on seeing how the Portuguese troops, the conditions under which they lived were shocking. And I just thought I could understand how a lot of them wanted to get out of that war. Then I was at Nyamapanda. First time, Harry Naismith was there with me, and he told us to. He heard a rumor that there were tours to the west of Nyamapanda, and he suggested we go out with send some of our constables down in civilian clothes with pistols to speak to the ladies in the fields to see if they could get any information, which we did. They went out, and then we lost sight of these guys. And then about half an hour later, there was AK fire and a few pistol shots, and the two guys came running back to us pretty quickly. We did follow up, and that we came up with nothing, but it started me thinking about doing sneak patrols and things, around villages and kraals and that. I went overseas on leave, had interesting times there, and then I was called in, and Guy Horton, who's the OC, a wonderful guy, he told me I was to take over F Troop. They flew us up by Dakota at treetop level, and it was quite amazing. I wasn't used to this, and all my the troop with me had never been in an aircraft before, and it was quite an eye-opening thing for us. We got up there, we did quite a few operations up there, high density up north of Darwin. At the time when I said that, you had the Mukumbura Surf Club there, which had enjoyable evenings, but there was an incident up there where Sulu Scouts had a tour who turned on his section and shot quite a few of the guys and killed and injured a few of them.
Yes.
I remember Ed's a fortunate guy there, and Neil Creel and Charlie Krause were there at the time. It's the first time and only time I ever heard of that ever happening. No, when we had the old Mukumbura Surf Club, and there was a guy, Keith Stingray Reynolds, who wasn't a support unit, but he transferred to the Army Engineers, and he was involved in that cordon saniteur, putting down the landmines and all that. And old Keith was a hugely entertaining guy. He used to entertain us in the evenings, and for some unknown reason, he billeted up in our camp, which was down behind the pub, and we had 3 rows of Danatwai all around the camp. And one night, old Keith came down from the pub down the slope there and forgot about the Danatwai. And I was in my tent to hear groans and moans outside my tent. And I got up to find Keith stuck in a wire, and it seriously took us about half an hour to untangle him out of that stuff to get him out. A lesson learned.
Yeah.
From there, the war seemed to stop. There was, I think it was all the detente things, and the nationalist factions were arguing amongst themselves in Zambia and Mozambique at that stage. And we used to go out in OP, and you see absolutely nothing, but other than baboons stealing maize and women trying to chase them out the lands and things like that. But suddenly, out of the blue, in the Rasamba area, while on OP, we saw 5 heavily armed Zanla guys coming up a river line or streamline, and we called out Fire Force. The guy who came out, I honestly believe he didn't believe that we had seen the enemy, and they remained there for about half an hour and did a few sweeps, but they left. And I was with Butch van der Nest and 2 other support unit guys, and we waited about half an hour and then crept down to the stream. It was evening now, and we swept for about 300 meters. Then we heard voices ahead of us, and sure enough, it was the opposition, and we opened up at them. We recovered the next morning. There was a dead tour, an AK, SKS rifle, an RPG launcher, and I think it was 3 rockets. And we followed Bloodspore, and there was Bloodspore going off in different directions as well. And after quite a bit of tracking, we lost it because the locals had sent cattle down there and covered up the spoor. But I was later told that 5-man group was literally neutralized because they were all injured in some way. It was quite. We recovered quite a few documents in it, and first time I'd ever seen Miles' little red book. And then we had quite a few fleeting contacts after that. The one of interest was that when we were sweeping through the resting place, we were attacked by a swarm of bees. And what these guys had done, they'd had a cylindrical bark-lined beehive in their camp. And on leaving the camp, they fired at the hive to disturb the bees. And it was quite successful. It slowed us up. But I remember that contact. We followed a heavy blood spore on that trail, which we eventually lost. And from information afterwards, we picked up that they'd made a hastily made stretcher, which they carried the guy out on. But other than that, we didn't get much out of that one. I must admit, the support unit troops, I really had a lot of trust in them. At times you'd be by yourself with up to 30 guys in the bush, and not once did I ever have a guy not refuse to do something. They always, and often, we had all African sticks going out, having contact with the tourists, and it worked both ways, that trust.
Yeah. Excuse my ignorance, Robert. As an army guy, I've struggled to understand the difference between support unit and PARTU. I know PARTU stands for Police Anti-Terrorist Unit, but aren't you both doing the same job, really?
Support unit was what other police forces call a mobile unit.
Okay.
Now, if there's a riot in a country, you could send a mobile unit to go and sort out the riots. They could be sent to any part of the country. As the war developed, support unit then evolved into a counterinsurgency unit, and that's how they developed into it. I believe after Mugabe got into power, they actually reverted back into blue uniform again and things like that afterwards. But it was a mobile unit. Part 2 was more of a counterinsurgency thing done with regular and police reserve members of the police.
Okay.
We were trained in.
Right.
And the big difference is support unit, it was all African sticks with usually a white section leader, and with part 2 there was all European sticks, usually with one constable with them as an interpreter, and that's the difference.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, I was in support unit. My last thing in support unit, we had President DuPont was standing down due to ill health, and I had to take my troop as the support unit contingent for the final parade at the Green Square at Morris Depot. And then from there, I was transferred to Mashonaland headquarters, and I was the section officer who had to stand in for any member in charge who was away on leave, to look after the police stations. The first posting I had was to Shambo, where Dave McNamara was away on leave. And I was there a short while after arriving. A local commercial farmer arrived with some half-eaten green maize cobs, which he said he'd found that some very hungry people had gone into his maize lands, and there was spore everywhere. And it was very suspicious. And I got hold of Jock Bandura. They sent in trackers, which landed up as quite a successful fire force operation, where there was some Frantam airstrikes by Provis aircraft, I think it was, and a few Zondler killed. But unbeknown to me, the contact was about 300 meters from the main tar road. And what had happened is a whole lot of farmers and farmers' wives had picked up their kids from the local school, had parked their cars on the edge of the road, and were having a grandstand view of this thing. And the council secretary, Colonel Blick, who was ex-Indian Army, he sent me a stink of a note saying that, they should have been advised and civil defense would have kept civilians out of the area. He was quite correct. And I later operated with his son Simon in SIS later on, who very successfully. He was a hell of a good guy. At Shamva, the other thing that happened there was there was a crop sprayer helicopter pilot who offered me a lift in his helicopter, a little bubble-shaped thing, and Shamva mine, there was a huge hole in the top of the mountain at the gold mine, and we went into this hole with the chopper, and you could still see old rotten rope dangling there where they used to sit. He told me they used to send people down there with charges to get the gold ore, which was then collected at the bottom of the hole by shafts coming into the edge of the mountain. From there, he took me to the farm where he was operating. He filled up his tanks with chemical, and I did a few spraying runs with him. I found it very frightening because he had these long booms out the side of the chopper and only sort of a meter above the ground. But it was another experience. And then the next station I had was Centenary. I had to stand in for Cass Cassidy there, who was on study leave. There was a minor ambush while I was there, but nothing serious. And yeah, that was Centenary. And then I got stationed back to Goromonzi, where I was then in charge. I was then had to do all the public prosecutor work, and I was in charge of crime inquiries there. I did that for about 4 or 5 months, and from there I was transferred to GC at Goromonzi. That was interesting. I did most of my work in the north, Chikwako TTL to the north. We also covered the Arcturus, Rua, and Bromley farming areas.
Did you come across Mike Norton from Special
Yes,
Branch?
I did. I used to meet Mike mostly at Nyamapanda, funny enough. I think he was at Kotwa.
Yeah.
But I never operated with him up the Arcturus area when he was there. While doing GC, I had 7 constables who used to operate with it, getting informers and things like that. Patrick Mawiri, who I operated with quite a lot, he phoned me from Juru Township, which was on the main Toka Road one night, and said that the tours were there and they were beating a businessman at the local beer hall. First light in the morning, I drove up there and I found Mawiri on the edge of the road. And we went to the saloon at the beer hall there and spoke to people, but everyone was just tight-lipped. They wouldn't say a thing. There was a lot of spore there, but there was a tar strip road there, and we couldn't follow anything. So Mawiri said to me that we should go down the strip road to speak to one of his informers to find out if he knew anything. And I'd been driving for about 5 minutes when I heard a huge bang behind us, and it was obviously a landmine. And turned around, went back to Juru, and there the local bus had hit a landmine. The left-hand side was completely blown apart, front left. Got into the bus, and the driver was slumped over the steering wheel. I saw no injuries, felt his pulse, but then I noticed the local African doctor was there treating passengers, and he advised me that the guy was dead, had a crushed skull. I asked the doctor if he knew anything about what had happened, and I just got a blank stare from him, nothing. I stayed there for a few days, and we eventually found out that the group had come across from Mrewa and hightailed it back to Mrewa after the landmine. And then shortly after that, I was invited to take over the SIS Special Investigation Section, the Mashonaland one. When I first heard about SIS when I was in support unit, and Brian Pitt, Alistair Hull, and Andy Gray, to me, what I recollect was they started it off in support unit together with some ground coverage constables who were attached to them. And it developed a support unit from there. But it was in 1976, it was decided that all provinces would have their own special investigation section. It was not a department of the police. It was just a section attached to sub-jocks and jocks as such. And you usually had a special branch guy who would get information for the section and deploy us out on that information. And anything we picked up in the field, we could react on immediately without having to call other sections, and which always took time. Pete Harris, who was with me at Goromonzi, he started the first Mashonaland section. It was in September when he finished, and he just said to me he was used completely incorrectly, and he was never given basic information as to what was happening in his area. it was Dave Enright, who was ex-British Army, who was our instructor, who did all our training with us. And after our initial training, Assistant Commissioner Pat McCulloch, who was on ComOps, gave us a talk to, and he just said if we weren't used correctly, I was to contact him directly and advise him, which I never had to do because we never ever had a problem. I believe Pat McCulloch, he was the one who thought about what was his brainchild, and his attitude was that experienced policemen should use their investigation abilities to try and follow up on the terrorists. And his attitude was that in normal times we were quite good at catching the baddies, so we had to convert this to finding the opposition. I managed to get Patrick Mawiri, who was within GC, with me to join up with us. He was made a Lance Sergeant, and our first deployment was to Mtoka. There I met Harry Naismith, who was the SB guy there, and a few others. And out of interest, on deploying, I had to go and collect ammo from the Morris Depot Armory. And Chief Inspector Dave Perkins called me in, and he took me through into the armory, and there were only 6 boxes of .762 ammo left in that whole huge armory. And that was a result of pressure from South Africa as a result of detente. And I felt quite guilty when he gave me a box of ammo to take to the field with us, that there was so little left. When we arrived in Mtoka, the police used to occupy the FAF5 Air Force pub there, the Choppers Arms. And there I met Ginger Baldwin, the pilot, who agreed to give us a 5-force lecture the following day. So we did a day, and we did a 4-hour live training with him. And it was hell of a beneficial, because the junior guys all realized how 5-force could help. It was a different form of warfare and how it would help us. The other interesting thing there was that we had Professor Dick Christie, who was in charge of the law faculty at Rhodesia University, who was flying a Dakota for the RLR Paras. And his wife was Philippa Berlin, who was a journalist. And she was a special, she was a boffin on Shona customs and things like that. And she gave the section a morning lecture after speaking to him. And it was hugely beneficial to us, what would be out of the ordinary in villages and crawls. And even the African members of the SIS section were hugely complimentary in how much they learned from her. It really helped us. Harry Naismith, we didn't have a lot of equipment at the time. We had one old TR-28 radio and one A60 radio, and then we had 3 sticks of 4. And he managed to bum radios from, we managed to get 3 A63s, so we each had a radio. Harry managed to come up with a night sight, which is hugely beneficial, for doing recce's around crawls at night and things like that. And Harry was a Scotsman, and he was one of the best int operators I ever worked with. He had a wonderful sense of humor and things like that. And our first patrol, he gave me a wonderful briefing on a Turk called McDonald, had a pseudonym called McDonald, who had been politicizing the area and committed quite a few murders in the area of tribal people and things like that. And our first patrol, we went out and doing OPs and crawls and ambushing between these crawls at night. And at the 4th night out, we ambushed on McDonald's group. I kicked it off by setting off a claymore. The next morning, we found one dead guy at RPD and quite a heavy blood trail from it. It was lost later. We lost the spoor later because of cattle being sent down the trail. But Harry told me about a week later that he'd picked up that McDonald had actually been killed in that ambush. It was months later that I picked up that McDonald was still around, and then later to be told that the scouts were using his pseudonym to operate in an adjacent area quite successfully. Lots of little things happen. It was around this period that a good friend of mine, Arthur Cumming, was attacked on his France farm at Victoria Falls, and he was killed. And his wife, Sandy, miraculously survived the attack. That was a bit of a shocker in my life. And we had our first, after our first 6 weeks, our first time off, one of the my African constables, a guy who nickname he used to call MAG, asked me if he could take a grenade home with him to the Victoria province area where he lived, because he'd heard rumors that there was Zanle in the area, and I allowed him to go. And MAG never returned. I can only presume he was either killed or captured by the tourists. It was a sad loss. And then after that, we were sent out to the St. Paul's Musami mission massacre, where the tourists arrived there and took 4 priests and 4 nuns out onto the road outside, opened up at them. One of the priests fell to the ground feigning death, and he was the only survivor of the 8. We got there. One of the patrol officers in my stick recognized the priest as having taught him at school when he was a school kid. And he got the horrific story from the priest about what had happened there. There were 2 other survivors, one old nun who fell down in her room when they were being rounded up and didn't get up again. She just stayed there. And there was another priest who was in another part of the mission at the time, and they didn't know he wasn't taken there. We did a lot of checking for spore there. There were 400 odd school kids playing soccer at the mission, and they were carrying on as if nothing had happened, laughing and playing soccer there. And my black troops, I literally had to restrain because they wanted to, do something about it. And I had to stop them because the press were around and this sort of thing. And it was while we were, there'd been heavy rain and very difficult to find spore. And while we were there, there was a Greek Cypriot came up to me who ran a trading store about 100 meters to the south of the mission. And he said to me he'd had quite a gunfight the night before, and he took me into his house. And next to 3 windows, there were bolt-action rifles lying on the floor. And the floor was scattered with cartridge cases. There were bullet holes in his walls from the outside and inside. And he had managed to fend these guys off. And I said to him, you better get someone else to come and help, look after you. And he said, no, he is an ex-Cypriot guerrilla fighter, and he was used to this sort of thing. And I don't know if he ever survived the war after that, but quite an eye-opener. I was told later that the scouts had managed to account for some of the guys involved in this incident near the Nyagui, south of Shamva. I had a batman called Sandy who I picked up at a fishing village on Lake Kariba when I was at Binga. And he was one of the most loyal guys you could ever come across. He worked for me for 10 years. And I'll never forget, on this same stint at Tokyo, RM hit a landmine with the rear wheel, and there were a few shots went off. We all debussed. There was a bit of chaos and return fire. And I'll never forget looking back and seeing Sandy sitting on the back of the vehicle, holding my pug dog, as if nothing had happened, and that all the policemen would just look after him. And to be that trusting that the people around you would just look after you and something like that just shook me. What we found was a few doppies and an old felt hat where the tours had left from their position, but nothing else came from it. Fortunately, the vehicle wasn't badly damaged because of the sandy roads and things. But, obviously the wheel and the hub damaged, but they managed to get it going again pretty soon. Threats had been made to farmers. Notes had been sent to them by the tours, telling them to get off their farms and things. And one of the guy's wives received personal notes threatening her. And then Harry asked us to get onto the farm and do recce's to see if we could find out, if the tours were resident on the farms or what was going on. And we went into the area clandestinely with the night sight, and what we were going to do was going to have a look at all the staff accommodation just to make sure that there weren't tours in and around on the farms. And on the way in, was going through a stream gully, and there were people walking towards us. It was pitch black, and opened fire, and unfortunately we killed the domestic worker. No, we shot the domestic worker in the leg and killed her baby, and her husband and the rest of the family were with her. There was curfews, and there was a reason for it, and we've been quite successful in sorting out the opposition as a result of skirmishes at night. But this had a hell of an effect on between employer-employee relationships. A few of the farmers felt we were partially to blame for the incident, and I'm sad to say a few farms were abandoned after that incident. It was a tragic thing that happened, but it wasn't nice. Yeah. There's a period after all this that we had quite a few punch-ups with 3 Commando. Should I go into that?
Yeah, why not?